Hi, I'm Calico Vargas and the MSW Field Coordinator at CSUP, and I am honored today to talk about a tough subject with these three amazing people here with me, Dan McFadden, Heather Pelser, and Sarah Skinner. And I just want to welcome you and thank you for your time. I also want to say that the subject matter could be triggering to some, so if you feel that you need to take a step back or pause at any time, please feel free to do that. And just know going in that this is difficult subject matter sometimes because we are talking about suicide tonight and suicide prevention. So, without further ado, I would like to give each of you a chance to introduce yourselves. Professor McFadden has to be probably leaving a little bit sooner than later tonight, so maybe we'll let you go first.
Well, thank you. So, as you heard, I'm Professor McFadden. I'm the MSW program coordinator. Um, I have 31 years experience in the military. Had a really rocky tour, I guess is the best way to put it, while I was in Iraq. And since we've come home, I've lost quite a few friends to suicide. Three that stick out most in my mind are guys that were in our platoon. We had all made it home, but we've had three guys just from our platoon that have committed suicide. One of them was one day before my birthday. I was actually driving up to the Springs from Pueblo to go to my MSW class, and I got the phone call that one of my guys had committed suicide. And then probably about 2, 3 years ago, I think it is 3 years now, our platoon leader on July 8th, I got word that he had committed suicide. And, it's something that we all take very hard, especially kind of in this field of social work, as a MSW student, not even a social master's level social worker yet, it really tore me up. And I was scrubbing my friend's Facebook to look for the signs and felt like I should have seen them. I should have known the signs, and realized that, especially when we're dealing with certain populations, such as veterans, a lot of times there are no signs, at least not direct signs. One of the things that I've noticed is, like with our platoon leader, he was a pretty angry fella, and then he just seemed to be at peace. And if we would have picked up on it, if we would have been looking for it, I think we would have recognized that that was definitely a sign. But really, that's what brought me into social work is kind of that trauma of, the traumas that I experienced in the military, but then the traumas of suicide. And that also caused me to create a course here at CSU Pueblo on understanding suicide that we offer to our MSW students. So that's my introduction. I'll let whoever wants to go next go next.
Thank you, Dan. Would either of you like to go next?
I can. My name is Heather Pelser. I currently am employed at Health Solutions as the Suicide Prevention Coordinator. But to give you a little bit of background information about me, I have a similar story to Dan's, not necessarily with the military, but I actually started my career working in child welfare. And I worked for 10 years in child welfare. And we had a ton of mandated trainings and professional development. And not one single time in 10 years did we ever have a training on suicide. In fact, it was never discussed. The most we were told is that if somebody threatens to harm themselves or harm somebody else, send them to crisis or the hospital. It's not your job. So I primarily worked on sex abuse cases. So suicide came up all the time. And every time I did exactly as I was told. But there was one family, I was their ongoing caseworker for close to 2 years. And I got to know them very well and spent a lot of time with them. And the teenage daughter was chronically suicidal. And so every single time she mentioned it, I would take her to crisis or the hospital. But she learned very, very quickly exactly what to say to not get admitted. And so it was just this ongoing circle that just never really resolved itself. Her mom ended up doing her treatment, did fantastic. Families reunited, case closed as it should have. Family moved back to their home state of North Carolina. And then I found out via Facebook in May of 2016 that that child had died by suicide. And it absolutely devastated me. I have always believed that I was born to be a social worker, and I didn't want to do it anymore because all I kept thinking was my job is to protect kids. It's in my job title. And I knew she was suicidal. So what does that say about me? And it put me in a dark place for a while. And as I really worked through my grief with that, as both personally and professionally, what I came to realize is that we have a systems issue. And this was a child who interacted with a lot of different systems and just got passed around. And we tend to pass people around without actually stopping and having a conversation with them. So it lit a fire under me. It actually led me to grad school to get my Master of Social Work degree, which I do have now. And through that process, I did an internship at Pikes Peak Suicide Prevention, really got into suicide prevention work, was hired by Health Solutions in June of 2018 as the Youth Suicide Prevention Coordinator for El Paso and Pueblo counties. Since that time, I've actually grown that. We have written 2 more grants. So now we have 3 full-time grants, and now I oversee all the suicide prevention efforts in Pueblo County as a whole. But on a more personal level, as I mentioned, I started this work in June of 2018. And then on January 26th of 2019, my son, who was 14 years old, lost his childhood best friend to suicide. It then came into my home in a very, very real manner. My own child was actively suicidal for probably about 1.5 years, and I had to fight like hell to keep my own kid alive while I was doing this work. So I am extremely passionate about systems level change. I think social workers are going to change the world. So I always get excited when I get to talk to social workers. Part of my job involves a lot of community outreach and training. I just spent the entire day today at the Pueblo Fire Department really talking about suicide prevention and changing the way we have this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. And social workers love to collaborate with other disciplines. So with that, let's hear from Sarah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Skinner, and I am actually the Assistant Director at CSU Pueblo for the Health Education and Promotion Department. So that oversees a wide variety of kind of wellness and well-being initiatives, suicide in specific, and kind of suicide prevention and outreach, and how does that really affect everybody. And I really wanted to get into the work of doing suicide prevention to kind of echo what Heather said, is help that like system change. I saw a big issue of people not knowing and wanting to have that conversation. And maybe if we just sweep it under the rug, it's not going to happen. But that's not the case. We have to actively engage and have these difficult and courageous conversations with each other and with our peers and with our coworkers and our superiors. And so that's why I really wanted to get into kind of suicide prevention and suicide prevention outreach, just because I saw the direct and the indirect impact that suicide does have on anybody and everybody, especially on a college campus, and how it affects students and everyone kind of across the board. I ended up getting my master's in organizational leadership and population health. So I kind of have that little bit of perspective, and I love working with social workers and with all of my master's of social work students, because it is a different perspective. And I commend the work that you all do, because you do all amazing work to be able to have these difficult conversations and really be those front running people that are out there doing this.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
And I think it definitely does. It's far reaching, the grips that suicide can have. I know I got a call from my best friend as a high school senior, and she had tried to commit suicide and called me and said, I need help. I'm in trouble. So I called 911, ran over to her house, and they had to take her to the hospital and pump her stomach and give her charcoal. And then in my early 20s, another one of my friends I found on her bed, passed out, and she also had tried to commit suicide. And then it came back around where we lost some friends later through the years after high school who we had gone to high school with. And then again, my daughters experienced the loss of 5 high school student friends while they were in high school. I also remember something similar to Dan. I used to teach fitness classes, and I had a lady who was working out right beside me in my class and thought she was doing great. She had been going through a hard time, and all of a sudden things started to look better. And next thing I knew, she was gone. They found her in the mountains, and she had committed suicide. Did not see that coming. And I'm really grateful for you guys being here and willing to talk about this today, because it exists and it needs to be talked about. And I think one of the things that people are always curious about are the signs. And I know Dan started to touch on that a bit, but does anybody want to go a little deeper there?
Oh, there's a couple that I think that often get missed, right? So I think as we go through life, and we, even when we're in high school and there's presentations on suicide, they always tell us kind of the basics. But I was part of a team that reviewed suicide deaths at the El Paso County Coroner's Office prior to COVID. And there were some themes that came up so often that I think are overlooked almost every time. Those signs, the first one is impulsivity and increased risk taking. When people are taking risk and they're being really impulsive, none of us ever think suicide. Like, why would your mind go there, right? But as Dan probably teaches in his class, there is a research scientist named Thomas Joyner who has a theory, and Thomas Joyner really talks about the ability for lethality, and that as human beings, we're not made to take our own lives. So how does one acquire that ability? So that impulsivity and increased risk taking is one that is missed so often, that's almost always present. The other one that Dan mentioned on is anger. I pulled some statistics recently, and 78% of suicides in Pueblo County in the past 5 years were males. 78%. And when you look back, what we see a lot of times is anger. And there's just this unexplained anger that's present that nobody really understands. And once again, when we see people who are mad, we don't think suicide. But the reality of it is that anger is actually a secondary emotion. And there's something else behind that. And so when people are angry and they're being impulsive and taking risks, I encourage everyone to change the way they think about that, and then look at some of the other factors as well. And then the third one, just real briefly, that we see almost every time is that of somatic symptoms, right? We know that trauma lives in our bodies. And so when people are having chronic pain, chronic headaches, stomach aches, can't sleep, and there's not a medical explanation, it doesn't mean they're making it up. It means there's something going on in their brain that's playing out in their bodies. And so it's extremely important that we understand.
I think we're freezing up over there for you, Heather. I don't know if you can hear me. Okay, maybe we can continue. Did somebody want to jump in?
So I would just like to say, I think one of the biggest things is, and I had mentioned this before just to Calico, but suicide is not something that we like to talk about. And we always feel like we shouldn't talk about it. I had the fortune of working for Peakview Behavioral Health, and I still do some contract work for them, but I got to work with a lot of young people. And by young people, I'm talking 7, 8 years old. And I had always had the impression, I had been told in the past, that if you talk about it to young kids, you're going to put ideas in their heads. I had also been told that kids of that age do not understand the finality of suicide. And I'm going to say that that's wrong. These kids really understand what it means. especially today. And so we as not just social workers, but even as parents, as friends, we need to be having these conversations when we do see some of those signs, if they are having some of those somatic symptoms, so the chronic headaches, and I say this cautiously because my coworkers know I've been having some issues with sleep, but the not sleeping, stuff like that, becoming aware. Um, when my kids were little, they had no problem seeing what they were doing on the internet. Of course, it wasn't as popular as it is today. But paying attention to that stuff, see what they're researching and looking up, and paying attention to all that. I know when I worked at Peakview, if there was a suicide at one of the schools, and I won't name the school, but we would all of a sudden get an influx of referrals and assessments because kids are trying to deal with and process through that and don't quite. It's not that they don't understand suicide, they don't understand why their friend would do that. And so, being able to have conversations, being able to talk about suicide is something that I think we need to do more often.
Thank you for jumping in there. Heather, when you left, you had been talking about somatic symptoms, and that's the last we heard. So I don't know if you
technology. My internet just froze everything and it kicked me out. So I apologize. But no, I was ending with the somatic symptoms and just saying that, we often forget that trauma lives in our bodies. And so if there's not a medical explanation, usually there's something going on in somebody's brain, and that we not ignore that. I'm not sure what the last thing you heard was, but that was the gist of that piece. I'm so sorry.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Sarah, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just a little bit want to touch on what Professor McFadden had kind of mentioned about the social media and kind of that those escalating things. I know not everyone is going to go out there and put out a status, but I know sometimes there's those memes or there's those little poetry sayings that people start to share. And if you start seeing people that really start sharing those like more often, or maybe it's uncharacteristic, maybe they used to share like, really, funny things. And then all of a sudden it kind of like started to take a turn there. That's kind of one of those things on social media that you can kind of look to. And I will say, at least Facebook has kind of come a long way. If you do see those kind of things and you are concerned about somebody, it's an easy kind of thing to report that. And if you want to remain anonymous, it lets you do that. And it also really encourages you to reach out to that person and just, let them know like, hey, I'm here. And I think that's a big piece of it, is just kind of letting people know that there is somebody really there that's seeing that on the other side of the screen and being like, hey, something here's a little funky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even those welfare checks, right? Just calling up and making sure the person knows somebody's checking in on them to make sure that everything is okay. Thank you. So what do you guys think a person can do to tell or to find out if somebody is suicidal?
I think the main thing is you just ask, right? There's this myth that if you ask somebody about suicide, you're going to put the idea in their head. And that's not possible. None of us are that powerful. If you ask somebody if they're thinking about suicide and they're not all of a sudden going to go, oh, that's a fantastic idea. It doesn't work that way. But having suicidal thoughts is normal. A lot of people live with suicidal thoughts. And if you can think about a time when you or somebody you know or care about has had thoughts of suicide, how incredibly scary that is, right? Mm-hmm. And so we don't have to say anything because we don't know how people are going to react. And so if you, in a caring and empathetic manner, could say, hey, look, this is what I'm seeing, and this is why I'm worried about you. Are you thinking about suicide? You're actually doing the opposite. You are lowering their risk just by asking them. You're opening up communication. You're building that connection. So, I mean, if nothing else, just understanding that asking is the number one thing that you can do, and don't let people off the hook. So if you say to somebody, hey, I'm worried about you, are you thinking about suicide? And they say, oh no, man, I'd never do that. That's not an invitation to walk away. That's when you need to tell them why you're worried and say, these are the things I'm seeing, what's going on? Because I think it's real easy for people to just say no. So we need to be persistent.
Great points. Yes.
So I agree with what Heather was saying. And honestly, asking those questions and getting that person some help. If you're that concerned, do what you can to get them some help. I've had a couple of friends get mad at me. I can think of one, I was still in the military. So I wasn't a social worker, didn't know anything other than this person had come to me and said, it was somebody that had been depressed for quite a while, and all of a sudden they were very happy. And she had told me she had bought a gun and had made up her mind that weekend was going to be her last weekend. And this was, I think it was like a Thursday afternoon, and not really knowing what to do. I let her go home. But after she had left, I talked to my boss and my supervisor and told them what was going on. And the next morning when she came into work, they had an ambulance come, they had the chaplain come, and she was mad at me for probably a good 2 weeks, wouldn't talk to me. After she got out of the hospital, though, because I had gone to the hospital to visit her a couple times, and she refused my visits. But after she got out, and a couple weeks later, she was like, "Thank you, you saved my life." So, I mean, if nothing else, it was worth it. I'm willing to let people be mad at me if it saves a life. And Heather, I just wanted to say, you've talked about trauma and it gets stored in our bodies. And I'm sure you're already aware of this, but that's why this book stays in my office. And I recommend this to all my students in the suicide and trauma class. So.
Dr. Bessel Vanderkolk.
Yep.
He's awesome. I love that book too. Thank you guys. Sarah, did you want to add anything to that part of the discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the piece is it's hard to ask that question, right? You don't want to, because it kind of goes back to it possibly, putting it in their mind that they're going to go and complete suicide if you mention it, and let's just sweep it under the rug and no one's ever going to talk about it again. So that's why I've kind of wanted to create my department and my program to really help kind of promote the intervention and kind of the awareness. So that's why I offer a lot of the QPR, which is question, persuade, and refer training, suicide and awareness prevention training, and also the mental health first aid. So it's two different kind of programs that gives my participants and you as students and peers and faculty and staff those tools to have that initial conversation of just like, how are you doing? Are you thinking about killing yourself? Are you thinking about completing suicide? And then knowing what to do next, because they, like kind of Heather said, might be like, oh no. And then you're like, oh, okay, yes, phew, okay, like got that conversation kind of over. But it's about, okay, you know what? I have kind of that funky feeling in my stomach. Like, what's going on? You've been these are the things I've been seeing. Or on the other hand, having somebody being like, no, things are going really, really terrible right now. And then knowing how to react to that without being like, ooh, I don't know. I don't know what to do. So both of these programs kind of give you the tools as a participant to be able to then talk with that person and then get them to those resources that are are above and out of your just a primary kind of scope and get them to a higher level.
And what I do, I also do the QPR training in the community. That's what I just trained the entire fire department over 3 days in that. But the one takeaway, I always tell them, I said, if you remember nothing else that I said, remember the word listen, because I think that we forget to just be quiet sometimes. And the suicide prevention, the core, the heart of it is really very simple. When we can be quiet and just listen and let somebody tell their story, in doing so, we're allowing them to get that out. Sometimes it's the first time they said it out loud, which can be very healing. But in the listening part, what you are doing is building a connection, and you're showing them that they are seen, they are heard, and they are not alone. And that is suicide prevention. So I tell people, even if you don't know what to do, if you listen and you say to them, hey, I'm really scared right now and I don't know what to do, but you and I are going to figure this out together. And then you go to the wellness center or you call Colorado Crisis Services or whatever it may be. That's really at the heart of it. So definitely there's more in-depth suicide intervention trainings, but really what's at the heart of it is that connection piece, listening to somebody and helping them get to help instead of just sending them away.
Awesome. So this is a question. I know that I provided you with some questions before you came, and I apologize because this doesn't usually happen to me. But I know that I've heard people before say, oh, they're just looking for attention. How would you respond to that kind of comment?
I feel like I'm talking a lot, but I just came off this training today and I'm like, this exact question came up. So there is this myth that people who talk about suicide don't do it. And I think that there are groups of people where it becomes part of their vernacular, where they're always talking about, I'm just going to go home and die, or I just want to go shoot myself in the head. And what happens is we become very complacent. Mm-hmm. Another one is people who live with borderline personality disorder. Chronic suicidality is part of their condition. And so we become very complacent and we're like, they say that all the time, or that's just this, they're totally fine. But we never know. You will never know. When people say that, there's usually some kind of truth behind it. If they're not, and it's just part of their vernacular, if you ask them about it each and every time, they're going to change their language. But the question that they just want attention, my social work answer is, yep, they sure do. And it's not that they want attention, it's that they need it. And so we need to figure out how to give them that attention in a healthy manner, right? So we need to get them away from talking about suicide. We need to figure out what's at the heart of that need and then be creative with hooking them up with a resource that is effective. So like when I was with the fire department, I'm like, they have chronic users that call 911 because they're lonely. The number of elderly people dialing 911 during COVID is off the charts because people are lonely. And so what I tell them is, I said, then you use your creative forces and your community resources, and you figure out a way to connect them with a peer resource so that they've got a peer support specialist who's calling them every day, and then they're not calling 911. So if the first thing that comes into your head is they want attention, the answer should be, yep, I wonder why. What's going on that they need that attention? And then being creative and trying to figure out how to get them that attention in a healthy manner.
Good. Thank you. Does anybody else have additional comments to that?
That was a great answer.
Right.
That's a great answer. Thank you for that. So another thing I'm curious about is when I got some training on suicide prevention, the person doing the training mentioned how important it is to ask, are you thinking about killing yourself? Are you thinking about suicide? Instead of just saying, are you thinking about hurting yourself? What are your responses to that? I'm just curious.
A lot of times I'll ask, if they are thinking of hurting themselves or killing themselves. And then I'll always ask, is there a plan? There's always follow-up questions. And I share in class, like I said, I've dealt with a lot of young kids who have been suicidal. I had a young boy, 8 or 9 years old. His plan was he was going to go drown in the ocean. I'm like, well, we're here in Colorado. Where's the ocean? And he was actually talking about the reservoir. You know, so even if you get something that doesn't make sense to you, find out what they're really talking about. And I like what Heather said as far as listening. We've always been taught we listen to respond. But when you're dealing with somebody that's suicidal, listen to hear.
And that statement, are you thinking of hurting yourself? I know there's some controversy over that, right? And there doesn't need to be, because you really just need to start a conversation. And if it's for some reason, it's easier for us to say, are you thinking of hurting yourself? But there does need to be an understanding that hurting yourself and killing yourself are two completely different things, which
Yes.
is what Professor McFadden was getting at, right? You've got to kind of get to, well, what's behind that? Because I will say, as the examples that have been given in here, when people come to that conclusion where they've made that plan, they've got it in place, a peace comes over them. And they don't look at it as hurting themselves. They look at it as ending the hurt. So while it's okay for you to say, are you hurting yourself? There needs to be follow-up to that. And you really need to get down to the down and dirty, but are you thinking of dying? So it's okay to say that, but there just needs to be that understanding that they may not see it that way.
Thank you.
Yeah, and kind of how Heather had mentioned is humans are not naturally, our instinct is not natural to kill ourselves. So to kind of have that actual question or that word come up in the question of like, are you thinking about killing yourselves? Somebody has actually come to the terms and the thought of like, okay, if I'm not here, then this is kind of where it is. And yeah, where hurting is, it does kind of have that wide spectrum of maybe is it possibly non-suicidal self-injury, and they are kind of doing that high risk and they're just speeding and they don't mean to be speeding, but you're going 130 down, a 55 hour per way. Can't talk. And end up crashing, and a deer comes out and you end up crashing and flipping the car, and then you didn't mean to complete, but it was kind of those things. So having that hurting kind of can go there. But yeah, I agree. It's just starting the conversation. If that is where you need to start, that's the critical aspect, just because that alone takes that courageous conversation piece to really be like, hey, I've seen something. Like, where are you at? Are you thinking about hurting yourself, or are you thinking about actually killing yourself?
And I think that as humans, right, especially if it's somebody that we know and care about, we don't want anybody we know and care about to be thinking about dying. And so I think a lot of times we ask questions that are begging for an answer of no, right? So I highly encourage everyone that if you're worried about somebody, it is no longer about you. And as hard as that is, you've got to turn it off. It's not about you. It's about them. And so we need an honest answer, not a gosh darn it, I hope they say no, because we can say things a million ways to Sunday to make somebody say no. But it takes a lot of courage and a lot of words in order to get someone to say yes. So really understand what is your goal with this. And while none of us want someone to say yes, we need to know where they're really at, because we can't help them if they lie and say no. So it's really about that intention and really turning it away from yourself, which I know is much easier said than done, but.
Ooh, I am curious what you guys think. I mean, I heard already about the listening and really, listening to hear and just kind of being there for a person. But are there additional things that you can think of that you can actually do for a person who is suicidal?
I will say, just for a resource for everybody, there's a great website called Now Matters Now. It was actually co-founded by Marsha Linehan, who is the founder of DBT, so dialectical behavioral therapy. But that is a great website that has a lot of DBT skills on there. But they have a stop, drop, and roll for suicide, and it's fascinating to me. But the very first thing is shut it down. And so if somebody's in that amygdala part of their brain, how do you shut it down or get them out of that? And there's literally two ways. One is to go to sleep. But if the person can't go to sleep, what do? And you stick an ice cube right here between your eyebrows, and it shocks you out of your amygdala, and it's found to like bring you out of your brain. So when we go out to events, we take these little ice packs, and especially for little ones, we're like, just stick it between their eyebrows right there. So just a little tiny thing. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it solves the immediacy of it. But I'm sure the other two have some better stuff than that.
Oh, I was gonna, what is that website?
It is nowmattersnow.org.
I had not heard about the ice cube there on the head before. I've heard about holding ice cubes. So that is interesting. Did either of you have more that you wanted to add to that piece? I know in mental health first aid, they talk about the algae.
Yeah, so they do the algae, which is kind of course, it's an acronym, which everyone, we always love acronyms, but essentially it's actively listening, and or I'll actually you assess. So you want to kind of assess your situation and assess your person, and this is always a non-linear kind of mode of conversation. But then you want to listen. Then you want to give reassurance. And I think that's the biggest piece also, is just knowing and sitting there with somebody and them knowing that you are there with them. And just, even if you don't have anything to say and they don't have anything to say, and while it may be kind of awkward and uncomfortable, just being there together and occupying space together. So that can be reassuring alone. And then we also have, then giving them the resources. So encouraging them to seek out either professional or kind of like peer-to-peer resources. So that's kind of a quick overview of what the algae is. And then the QPR is also a little bit sort of the same, not the same, but it does give similar kind of key points that you can like look for. But I think really it is just going, I do think that piece of listening to just have them be heard is like essential, and not listening to respond, because again, at the end of the day, it's not going to be about you, and you have to shut that off. And sometimes it's going to be really hard. And I know Dan kind of mentioned that his one friend that he had that conversation with, she was mad at him for a long time. And you can't take that personally, because I like to say not all heroes wear capes, they wear jeans, because he possibly saved their life, because he was able to sit with the fact that like, okay, they are going to be mad with me, but I'd rather them be mad and me be able to see them in a month than me be mad and not be able to see them. So I think it is going to be coming to terms, and it's going to be hard, and it's really difficult that first time somebody's like, no, or they're like, that's dumb. Why would you even mention that? Or they throw it back in your face and you're like, oh, don't get defensive. It's okay. It's, again, I hate to say it, but it's not about you. They're in that place, and you just kind of need to sit with them and be in that place with them, and then have that kind of next step, or just see where they need to go from there.
And to kind of piggyback on that, it's so important to understand that if you yourself are not in a place where you can be the person to ask that question, or you have this gut feeling that something's wrong and it can't be you, and there's a million reasons why that may be, then just get somebody else involved. And if there's nobody else that you can think of to get involved, call Colorado Crisis Services, go to the Wellness Center, find a professional. It doesn't have to be you if it's going to harm you emotionally, but you do have an obligation to let somebody know and get somebody involved.
And I would say, if you can be present with that person. I like what Sarah was saying. When I'm dealing with somebody who's amped up like that, my phone can go off as much as it wants. I don't care. You know, my wife can text me all she wants. I'm going to be there for that person. They are the most important thing in that moment of time. And I want them to know that they're the most important person. Because if I start doing this, I show them that whatever's happening on my phone is more important than that conversation that we're having. And they need to know that they are so important.
That's beautiful. It's true. I know we've already kind of touched on this in our time together, but my other questions were around what kind of resources there might be for someone who might be thinking about suicide, having suicidal thoughts, or even plans, and what other kinds of help might there be for someone who's thinking of trying to help a person in that situation. So we listed already, there's mental health first aid. There is nowmattersnow.org, nowmattersnow.org, crisis line.
Colorado Crisis Services, right?
There's a suicide hotline, which is 1-800-273-8255.
And then we've also, so I run the Suicide Prevention Coalition of Pueblo County. And when I first started this job, when you would Google suicide prevention or suicide in Pueblo, it would lead you to the suicide center that's no longer there. So it'd give you an address and a phone that don't exist, which is not helpful. So we were able to, in January of this year, with help from Pueblo Web Design, start a website, and it's pueblosuicideprevention.org. When you go on that site, we have all kinds of resources. So if you're having thoughts of suicide, you're worried about somebody who's having thoughts, you've lost someone to suicide, or you just want more information, all of that is on there. It includes national and local resources, as well as local, like here are the places that you can walk into to get help right now. But it is specific to Pueblo County. And it's just, yeah, so that's a resource as well.
Awesome. Can you repeat that resource one more time?
It's pueblosuicideprevention.org.
Fantastic.
Trying to keep it as simple as possible.
All right. The other thing I think is pretty cool is the texting 741-741. And I just think that's cool because I know working with our students, a lot of them seem to prefer texting. And I like the fact that they've developed something where people can reach out in a mode of communication that seems to be easier for some. All right, I will kind of just ask you guys if there's anything else that you would like to bring up. And if not, I want to open it up for just a few minutes for maybe some comments or questions from the chat, from the audience.
I just can't. I think the QPR training and the mental health first aid training that is offered on campus with Sarah, if you get the opportunity, take it. I have trained, we just did the statistics. We've trained over 400 people in Pueblo County this past year, this grant year cycle. We're getting the same language out throughout the community. And I can't even tell you, the feedback I get is amazing. It's very much, that's what people are needing. So find out from the Wellness Center when they're offering those. We offer them quite a bit as well, but I highly encourage, we've actually had a couple CSUP students take mine. But just, I think it's such a valuable training and kind of really is just the basic oversight of that.
Yeah, so I offer both of them on kind of a bi-monthly, depending on if I have participation, but I offer them every other Thursday, and I have a schedule on my website, and then also not an intake form, but if you or a classmate or anybody want to get a group together, I can also go in and do small group sessions, whether it's on campus, and then I do know Heather does it a lot in the community, but what's also nice about these programs is we can co-facilitate too. So that's what's really nice is we can all do these kind of things. And like she kind of mentioned, it's just getting the language. It's getting consistent language out there and across the board, and just, again, opening it up to have these conversations and really starting that piece of it. So I can get that out, and I will get that full kind of schedule. I can get that to all of the stakeholders here as well.
I would also like to add, I graduated with my master's of social work degree in August of 2020, so a year ago. I went to an accredited school in Colorado Springs. I went to Newman. We received 1 hour of training on suicide. It was outdated and it was wrong. So the fact that CSUP and Professor McFadden are offering this as a course is phenomenal. It's not happening in other places like it should be. You all are very, very lucky to have that. And I encourage everybody to take that course, because everybody that works in this field should have that. And the fact that it's not offered is just horrific in my mind. So kudos to you all, and definitely take that class.
I agree. That's so important. In the positions that I've held as a social worker, I've had to do assessments for suicide and homicide, and it is something that you're going to come up with in therapy sessions with people in all different types of venues and contexts. Thanks for doing that, Professor McFadden.
Well, I think that's, one of the things that we definitely talk about in that class, because so many new social workers, they're so afraid of having that conversation. And how do you have that conversation? And then what do you do with that information once you have it? And that's really what we kind of try to go through in the course and help people understand that, well, yes, suicide is scary. I get that. But it doesn't have to be as scary as we make it in our minds to be. In just the fact that we can have those conversations, and like I said, to be present with that individual so that they know that somebody cares, that's the key to it.
And everyone's already taking the first step by being here and by listening and having this conversation, because again, a year or two, or even, 10 years ago, this type of conversation would have never happened. There would have never been a group that would have been comfortable enough to be able to sit down and really have this difficult conversation. So I do want to say thank you for Professor Calico for getting this set up, and the other great panelists for sharing your insights and stories. So I just want to say thank you, because it is the first step.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you all being here so much. I don't see any questions yet in the chat, so we'll give it just maybe a couple more minutes if anybody wanted to. I do want to say, Sarah, that I also can teach mental health first aid, so if you ever want a co-facilitator, please let me know. I would love to join you in that.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, I apologize. Yes, I love that.
There's nothing to apologize about.
We've also, so one of my colleagues and I have become ASSIST trainers, and ASSIST is a 2-day suicide intervention training. It's generally pretty expensive, but with grant money and then through Health Colorado, where she works, we can help fund some of those. So if you want to at any point in time offer that for your social work students or for the staff at the Wellness Center, please just let me know. It's a great training. The problem right now is that it's a full 2-day training, which is very difficult for people to attend in our crazy world right now. But in the future, that is always something we can help with and assist with.
That's awesome. Thank you, Heather. All right. I think I know that you guys probably are all off to many different things with all the hats you wear, and I really, really appreciate the conversation, and thank you so much for taking time to be here and sharing your knowledge, and I just really appreciate each one of you.
Thank you. I appreciate being here as well.
Thanks, everyone. Happy
Go social workers. Yay.
Go.
Thank
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.